Hi there. Now, most people are aware that Iraq's current national currency is, of course, the Iraqi dinar. Now, one thing you probably didn't know is before October of 2003, there was actually two different Iraqi dinars. Now, the first one was known as the Swiss dinar. Now, all Iraqi banknotes that were printed before 1990 are known as Swiss dinars. Now, apparently, the nickname was due to the fact that the printing plates that were used to print these banknotes were made in Switzerland. Now, one example of a Swiss dinar banknote is right here. This is a 10 dinar banknote from 1980. So that there is an example of a Swiss dinar. Now, the second Iraqi currency that was in Iraq was then known as the Saddam dinar. Now, all banknotes printed from 1990 until October of 2003, they're known as Saddam dinars simply because of the fact that they all had an image of Saddam Hussein on them. Now, some examples of Saddam dinars are a 50 dinar banknote from 1991. Okay, and right here you have a 100 dinar banknote from also 1991. And right here you have a 10 dinar banknote from 1992. Now, just some background information. Now, of course, Iraq had or went to war with Iran from 1980 until 1988, and this was absolutely devastating economically for Iraq, and Iraq, of course, was heavily in debt. Now, to make matters worse, you then had the Gulf War in 1990, which then Iraq was already devastated as it was, but now the country was basically in shambles due to the Gulf War, and Iraq was even further in debt now. So what happened was, of course, like what usually happens when a country's at war, is Iraq was forced then to print massive amounts of money. In this case, it was the new issue of currency known as the Saddam dinar, again printed from 1990 until October of 2003. Now, these were printed, of course, to help rebuild the country as well as help Iraq with its debt. Now, of course, this is not unique to Iraq. Even the United States of America was known to print money, for example, due to the Vietnam War. That's actually one of the things that contributed to the ending of the gold standard in 1971 was the huge cost associated with the Vietnam War. And of course, let's not forget 60,000 American deaths. So anyway, now what happened was, starting in the 1990s, when the Iraqi government then started printing these Saddam dinars in mass quantities, again because of the war and because of debt, what happened was in the northern parts of Iraq, in the Kurdish areas, they actually refused to accept these new Saddam dinars, and they continued to use the pre-1990 Swiss dinars. Now, what happened was then, the Iraqi government then deemed in the early 90s, all Swiss dinar banknotes no longer legal tender, and all Iraqis were required to exchange any Swiss dinar banknotes they had for the new Saddam dinars. But of course, the people in the northern areas of the Kurdish part of Iraq, they refused to exchange the money over for the new Saddam dinars. So what essentially happened was then, even though both currencies were theoretically the Iraqi dinar, and it really was one currency, it ended up then morphing into two currencies. You had two Iraqi dinars in Iraq. You had the Swiss dinar used in the northern Kurdish area, and then you had then the Saddam dinar used in the rest of Iraq. Now, one very interesting thing to note, though, about the two Iraqi dinars is they both had different values. Now, the reason for this, of course, is because after 1990, because the Saddam dinar was printed in mass quantities, you had then inflation in Iraq. The Iraqi dinar essentially was plummeting in value because the money supply of the Saddam dinars kept increasing every single year. Now, what happened was with the Swiss dinar is because of the fact that the Swiss dinar was no longer printed after 1990, the Swiss dinar actually maintained its buying power because the the money supply of the Swiss dinar was no longer increasing. So it was actually very interesting to note that it maintained its buying power while at the same time the Saddam dinar kept losing value because the money supply kept increasing. Now, one interesting thing, though, to note is, again, like I said, the Swiss dinar in the early 90s was actually deemed no longer legal tender by the Iraqi government, and therefore it would not be accepted anymore. But the people of northern Iraq, they still accepted it, even though the currency technically was no longer legal tender. So officially it had no value, but unofficially it had value because people still accepted it. And that's actually one thing that's very interesting about the Swiss dinar is technically, by definition, it was no longer a fiat currency. Now, fiat currency, of course, is money that simply has value because government deems it to have value, and it's legal tender under law. That is fiat currency. But under definition, the Swiss dinar, after it was no longer legal tender, technically wouldn't be considered fiat currency because it was no longer under law legal tender. So, I mean, you could maybe classify that as perhaps a private currency, maybe a barter currency, but it was not technically by definition fiat anymore. Now, one interesting thing to note as well is finally then in October of 2003, when Iraq then issued a brand new Iraqi dinar, they then replaced the two existing Iraqi dinars, the Swiss dinar and the Saddam dinar. Now, one interesting thing is that the Saddam dinar was exchanged for the new Iraqi dinar at a ratio of 1:1. So for every Saddam dinar you would give the bank, they then would give you 1 dinar worth of the new currency. Now, the Swiss dinar, because of the fact that, again, like I said, the money supply was smaller and it was no longer printed after 1990, it was actually exchanged at a ratio of 150:1. So for every Iraqi dinar you would give a bank, they would give you 150 of the new one. So one great example right here is, of course, here again is the Swiss dinar. That's a 10 dinar note, and here's a Saddam dinar. That's a 10 dinar note as well. This one here was exchanged at 1:1, so you would get 10 new Iraqi dinars for this one here. However, this one here, you would actually get 1,500 of the new Iraqi dinar that was issued in October of 2003. You know, so anyway, it just goes to show, you know, about money when people always ask the question of what gives money value. Now, of course, what gives it value currently is the fact that it's fiat. If you have a $100 bill, it's worth $100 because the government simply says it's worth $100. It's you know, legal tender, therefore that's what gives it value. But again, the Swiss dinar was not legal tender. The government did not accept it, but it still had value because people still accepted it, because they believed it had value, and it still was accepted in day-to-day commerce and business. It still had value, and it just is very interesting that a currency that was no longer legal tender, in the end, like I said, in October of 2003, it was actually worth 150 times more than the Saddam dinar, which was legal tender. I mean, it's just a very interesting thing to note that a non-legal tender currency is actually worth more than the legal tender currency that replaced it. You know, so anyway, that's one of the things that gives money value. You know, it's fiat because government says it has value, but it's simply, you know, money could be whatever you want it to be. It's simply, as long as someone's willing to accept it, it has value. And that's a very interesting thing that I find interesting about the Swiss dinar. You know, a dead currency that, you know, officially it's dead, but unofficially people still accept it. And it maintained its value right up until October of 2003. Even though in the early 90s it wasn't legal tender anymore, you know. So anyway, that was my video about the two currencies of Iraq. Again, like I said, you started with one currency, one Iraqi dinar, and it then morphed into two Iraqi dinars, the Swiss dinar and the Saddam dinar. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Anyway, have a great day. Thanks.